Birth rates are absolutely plummeting across the globe, and honestly, no one seems to have a really clear answer for why. But what if the explanation has less to do with economics or policy and more to do with the fate of the American horse? Yeah, you heard that right. Let's dig into this pretty unconventional theory for one of the biggest demographic shifts in human history. So, to get to the heart of this, we're going to start with a simple question that economist Catherine Pakaluk asks her students. And it's this: what would I have to give you to make you buy a horse? Seriously, think about it for a second. More land? Maybe a stable? How about free food for life? What would it actually take? Well, the student's answer is usually pretty blunt. One young man just said it flatly: a horse is just a liability. In that one sentence, that is the key to this entire argument. 100 years ago, a horse was an asset, right? A necessity. But today, for most of us, it's just a massive, expensive inconvenience. I mean, the way the car replaced the horse was just swift and total. The Model T wasn't just a little better, it was a quantum leap forward. It was faster, it was cleaner, it didn't need to be fed all the time, and let's be real, it didn't leave 30 pounds of manure on the street every single day. The car simply did the job of transportation better, cheaper, and way more efficiently. And this pivot happened with just incredible speed. So in 1908, the Model T arrives. Only 2 years later, the horse population peaks and starts its historic freefall. By 1917, that's less than a decade after the car's introduction, horses were completely gone from the streets of New York City. A cornerstone of life became obsolete almost overnight. Now, this isn't just a story about technology. It's really about a concept called functional theory. And the idea is pretty simple. Our culture, our habits, our norms, they're all built around fulfilling some kind of basic need. So when a better tool comes along to meet that need, like the car for transportation, the entire culture shifts to make room for it. Horse culture just gave way to car culture because the job of the horse was replaced. Which brings us to the core of the argument here in Section 1, the new uselessness, or as the source puts it, how children lost their economic job. And there it is, the core thesis, laid bare. The argument is that children, just like horses, have been functionally replaced. They've become, in a purely economic and utilitarian sense, well, useless for meeting the fundamental needs they once served for literally millennia. The source argues this happened because 3 specific jobs that children used to do were just outsourced. First, their role as a source of labor. That was taken over by machines and general economic growth. Second, their function as old age support, replaced by social insurance programs like Social Security. And finally, effective contraception meant they were no longer an unavoidable outcome of a sexual union. And the data really reflects this functional collapse. To keep a population stable, you need a replacement rate of about 2.1 children per woman. But look at these numbers. The USA is at 1.59. Spain is way down at 1.1. And South Korea is at a staggering 0.75. This isn't just some local trend, it's a global implosion. Okay, so this leads us to Section 2, need versus want. If the need for children has basically evaporated, what's left? This next part explores the 2 remaining reasons for having a child in our modern world. And the speaker makes a really crucial distinction here. On one hand, you have children of need. These are kids people have to fulfill their own personal desire to be a parent. It's sort of a consumerist, identity-driven motive that often leads to being one and done. But then there are children of want. These are children who are wanted for their own sake, as an intrinsic good. And the source argues that this motive is typically nourished by a living religious tradition. So if the problem is really a lack of want, you can start to see why the typical policy solutions might not be working. The argument is that throwing money at the problem, like Hungary spending a full 5% of his GDP, completely misses the point. It assumes that people are biologically hardwired to want kids, and they just need more resources. But if that fundamental desire isn't there in the first place, the money doesn't create it. To really get the children of want perspective, just listen to this quote from Esther, a mother of 9. She sees children not as a cost or some kind of project, but in the exact same category as health and sustenance, as a fundamental blessing that you can never have too much of. And here's another really powerful perspective from Leah, who's a musician. She reframes motherhood not as something that takes away from her contribution to the world, but as her primary contribution. In a world that's so focused on careers and personal achievement, this view is, as she says, almost radical. And all this brings us to the final part of the argument. Section 3, a question of faith. This is the speaker's proposed source of that powerful want. The speaker calls this source the fire of faith. She describes it as the antivenom to the economic wound that children now bear. Basically, it's a force that completely reorients a person's values. It shifts the entire calculus away from worldly comfort and towards something eternal, making the sacrifices of parenthood not just tolerable, but joyful and deeply meaningful. And this isn't just some abstract theory. The source points out that this deep conviction is already leading people to live these really countercultural lives. It's presented as the main reason why a developed nation like Israel still has an above-replacement birth rate, completely bucking the global trend. So, what's the big policy takeaway here? Well, according to the speaker, it's a radical one. The advice for governments is to stop trying to directly incentivize births. Instead, they should practice what she calls relentless deference to religious communities, letting them run schools and welfare programs because they're seen as the only institutions capable of actually cultivating that fire of faith. In short, government has to do less so that churches can do more. Now, this is, of course, a very charged topic. During her research, the speaker was interviewing a man who, while wearing a MAGA hat, kind of quipped, "So, is your study to make fertility great again?" And that question, it just perfectly captures how this whole demographic issue is intertwined with our deepest cultural and political divides. And her answer to that man's question is really the ultimate summary of her entire argument. She concludes that the only path back to a culture that truly values children isn't through some government program, but through a spiritual revival. So, that horse analogy suggests that once something loses its function, it doesn't just disappear entirely. It becomes a niche interest, right? A passion project. So, if children are no longer a universal need, the central question for our future becomes, what, if anything, can make them a powerful, society-shaping want?